Welcome to this webinar on archives and history. As your area chair and common leader for this uniform session created in conjunction with the National Archives and History team, I want to especially give thanks to Area Director Monica Boone Allen for appointing me to this position, also to National President Kimberly Jeffries Leonard for giving me the opportunity to serve on the National Archives and History team. I also want to give special thanks to my area committee, which has helped us tremendously to put on this webinar. I'd like to introduce my area committee: Deborah Powers, Alexia Hudson Ward, Judith Presley, and Vanessa Baker Latimer. The four presentations of the webinar will include Archivist as Legacy Keeper, Chapter Archival Program, the ABCs of Archiving, and Repository Considerations. Setting up your archives. In 1972, Archives and History was listed as a standing committee at the 18th National Assembly. If this is not in your chapter bylaws, what you'll need to do is establish it or activate it. This needs to be done by a chapter vote. The Archives and History Committee takes the lead in establishing or maintaining your collections for their continued historical value. With that in mind, the chair of the committee needs to be appointed with these thoughts in mind.
Greetings, Sister Links. My name is Alexia Hudson Ward of the Cleveland, Ohio chapter, and I serve as a proud member of the Central Area's Archives and History Committee. This section is going to review archivists as legacy keepers. So let's start with a couple of key terms. First, archivist. So naturally, that is the role that many of you all are serving in or you're interested in serving in. This is the person that is principally responsible for advancing and supporting and protecting the archives of the chapter. Oral history is the history that is taken typically by the archivist or a member of the Archives and History Committee of the chapter of an individual of principal importance to the history of the chapter. And so that may be an alumni member, that may be a member that has more than 25 years membership, but that could also include capturing the oral history of connecting links and also AIR links. AV archives, audiovisual archives, are those materials that are either audio or visual in content. So that could be videos, that could be Zoom meetings that are recorded, meetings that are recorded on Skype, or it could just be pure MP3 or MP4 audio files. In terms of digital archives, those are the materials, Sister Links, that are electronic. We have a term in the information professions that we describe some materials as born digital. So that's a lot of the materials that we deal with now in LinkedIn are materials that have started off as electronic documents. But then there's also the transferring and digitizing of print materials. Both of those materials constitute digital archives. Preservation is a tactic through which we make sure that digital materials, audio materials, and or print materials are preserved in perpetuity. And there is a whole range of preservation actions and services that you can apply to your materials to ensure that generations to come will have access to the materials. Disposition or a disposition strategy is that where an archives group will make a determination around what materials no longer have historical value or meaning to the chapter or to the organization, and will make a decision to destroy those materials. Those materials sometimes are shredded. Those materials are sometimes just, often just tossed in the trash. We want to make sure, however, that we take extra special care when we make the decision to remove items from our archives and that we move forward with a disposition strategy. Chronology is a timeline in which most archivists can really contribute to richly. And the chronology could be the starting of the chapter, the starting of a particular chapter initiative, but it is in essence a timeline. An appraisal, Sister Links, is an appraised item or a series of items. And so for those of you all who have precious items in your personal collections, so whether that may be a designer handbag set or a home or precious jewels, often those items come with what is referred to as an appraised value. The same thing applies for our archives. And so getting an appraisal of the archives means that you have solicited the advice of a professional, skilled individual who can assign a cost or a value to the archives. This is oftentimes important for insurance purposes. Chain of custody is the practice through which determinations are made as to which leaders within the chapter has the ability to hold materials, to move materials, to shift materials around, to enter into agreements with repositories, etc. Chain of custody is so important, particularly as we think about some of the natural disasters that have regrettably impacted Links chapters throughout the central area. You want to know where your important items, like your chapter's charter, as an example, is held, and who has the authority, literally, to have the original document in their possession. Chain of custody is super important. A retention schedule, Sister Links, allows you the opportunity as a chapter and as the Archives and History Committee to frame out how many years you intend to retain certain materials. And so, in other words, you may decide that in partnership with the guidance that comes from the National Archives and History Committee, in partnership with the area committee, that certain financial records are no longer necessary for the chapter, and it doesn't really enrich the history of the chapter. A retention schedule is very specific and very clear on what materials need to be held for how long and the appropriate method through which those materials are to be destroyed. And so that is, in essence, that's how your disposition and retention schedule kind of play into each other. A repository is an entity, an official entity, through which your materials will be interred as a chapter. And so some libraries function as repositories. There are also historical societies and other entities where there are certified professionals that have the ability to catalog and manage your materials, but also to ensure that the materials will be protected and that those materials are within the appropriate HVAC environment so that they don't get too hot, too cold, too moist, and will ultimately be destroyed. But the role of the repository is to ensure that your materials survive in perpetuity. So let's talk about archives and records very briefly. And so naturally, there are a lot of engagement elements as it relates to the creation and the management of archives and chapter records. And so we talked a little bit about oral history as being a part of the record of the chapter, but the same applies with photographs. What's really important, Sister Links, is that you have some form of a collection policy because no one has infinite space to store materials, not even the Library of Congress or the United States National Archives. So these large entities have a collections policy. And so it is important that at the chapter level, a collections policy is determined as well. And what that policy will inform is what materials you will keep and why. And should someone want to give the chapter or gift to the chapter materials, what are those corridors? What are those guardrails in which you will make those determinations around what will be a part of the collection of the chapter? We already touched on preservation a bit, but preservation is so important. We can't emphasize it enough around managing your archives and your records. And then also, and this is where a professional repository will really help out a lot, is the determination of an access and use policy. And so what you want to do in partnership with your repository, and if you don't have one, you want to make sure that you establish it as a part of the chapter's practice, is to outline in your collections policy as a subset of the policy, what is the access and use policy? In other words, when can people access the materials and why? Can the materials be published in books and other for-profit entities, and how? So all of these pieces are super important. Sisterlinks, you really should think of yourselves, if you are a current chapter archivist or aspiring chapter archivist, as our preserver in chief. So naturally, there is the chapter chair, but then there's also the committee. You will receive support from the area committee as well as the national committee. But also, it's so important for archivists to be a part of leadership succession planning as it relates to the successful transfer of records. That management piece is so important, and it is a huge opportunity area for us in LINCDom. And remember that earlier in this presentation, we talked about that chain of custody plan. The archivist absolutely should be the primary steward of the chain of custody plan, ensuring that all essential records are in the hands of those who need them and in the hands of future leaders as they transition into the role. The Archives and the History Committee is really about preparation and establishment. You really want to make sure that you are creating a solid framework to manage your materials. And some of that includes best practices of identification and adoption of certain materials, but also being very clear around the ways in which the Archives and History Committee feeds and fuels into the essential internal processes of good operations of every chapter. There are a lot of reference guides and tools that are available to support you in your success. So we, of course, have our National Archives Manual, but then the national and the area repositories, along with local repositories, can really help you to establish those best practices and that chapter level framework for success. And as many of you know, the Legacy Keeper Scorecard is due annually each May. The archivist and the historian really serves in dual roles. And a lot of times, Sisterlinks, people think of the archivist and the historian as a person who looks retrospectively and preserves retrospectively. But in fact, the role is a part of the continuing and ongoing life history and life cycle of the links of our chapters, etc. And so we need you to bring that important records management perspective into this work, in addition to the retrospective actions of managing the history and the historical records. So think of yourselves as the chief legacy keeper of all the richness that is contained within your chapter, current and past.
I want to inform you about some updates. Now available are release forms in case you want to use photos, documents, or anything that's been uploaded or printed in the links incorporated in area or chapter publications. Also, the Legacy Keeper scorecards are now due annually on the May 15th deadline. And the last update, the Vision and Legacy exhibit will be part of the National Diamond Anniversary Celebration and the 43rd National Assembly. The mission statement should be in agreement with your chapter bylaws and your chosen repository's role in coordination with the links incorporated. The statement should be clear and concise. It should address the purpose, the why, such as to collect, preserve, and identify the organization's role in records and personal property, to make the records available to researchers and scholars, and to augment your chapter's image. Also, it should include the what, milestones from your chapter's history, items that showcase the heritage and service to the community, leadership roles of members, community impact, bound minutes, the format that will be accepted. Are you going to have digital, print, physical, or tenure records? Check with your chosen repository to see what indeed they will accept. The third step is to write a policy statement. The collection development policy connects archival material to the overall mission and vision for the program. This policy should state what to be selected, to be collected, and what isn't. There is also a document on the members only section that determines how long records are going to be kept and what should and should not be shared. Ceremonies and rituals should never be shared. Will restricted or confidential records be accepted? Who will decide which records are going to be accepted? Will it be the archives chair or will it be the entire committee? A strong policy statement stops the archives from being a collect-all for all unwanted materials, documents. So make sure that the policy statement is strong. Also included in your policy statement should be the access policy. Who is going to be able to access these records? Is it going to be members only, or will it be open to the public? You also have to establish the legal authority with your repository that you have chosen and the transfer of materials. Will it be as a deed of trust, or will it be as a deposit? And that will be further explained in the next segment. Initial date of transfer and any frequency. And finally, financial obligations, either for the chapter or for the repository. Keep in mind the need for archival materials in order to preserve your materials. This should be listed as a line item in your chapter's budget.
This presentation is going to examine what we describe as the ABCs of archiving. So let's start with talking about the arrangement of materials. And the most principally important detail I want to share on this slide with you is, where are your files? So before we can even have a conversation around identifying what we want to save and deciding what's most important to us, we have to make sure that we really know where our organizational files are housed for our specific chapters. And so in other words, are your files on your cell phones? That's happened definitely with some chapters. Are they on various forms of disks, computers, scattered about in different boxes in different locations? Everyone, it's super important that we determine first where the material is that is important to the chapter's history and archival excellence practices. And then from there, we can talk about identifying what you want to save, going through the material to decide what is most important, putting some structure around how to organize it, making sure that there is one copy at least of the most important materials, and that you want to have some type of plan to manage archives in different places and over an extended period of time. So here's some examples, everyone, of the types of materials that we reference when we're talking about archival materials. And some of these things may be surprising to you. So for example, If it is germane to the history of the chapter, you want to make sure that you are collecting things like family histories and church bulletins or newsletters, also awards and certificates, home videos, movies and audio tapes, anything that's genealogical that again points to the history or the founding of the chapter, brochures and flyers, scrapbooks, diaries, memoirs, etc. I think you get our drift here. But there's definitely elements to this that's important to underscore, and that is that the history of our organization is rich and can be contained in a wide range of materials. And so you want to make sure that you're capturing it to the best of your ability. And so most of us comb through a lifelong collection of personal papers and photos, either when we have free time or when we deal with the belongings of someone who was dearly departed. And all too often, that job seems so daunting and overwhelming that our natural response sometimes is to get discouraged, or we may feel overwhelmed to say, I don't know where to begin. It feels a little too much. It's a little too overwhelming. Or in the worst case scenario, there have been decisions to just get rid of it all. I just want to purge it and get rid of it and don't address it. So let's walk through Archives Defined. And so Archives Defined, Sister Links, is really a collection of historical documents and records. It is also an accumulation of historical records. So keep in mind that a collection of records is something where there is intentionality, but materials can accumulate over time as well. Archives can also be the physical location where records are located, and primary source documents that are accumulated over the course of a chapter or organization's life cycle, and also the life cycle of an individual. And so in terms of archiving versus data backup, it's important that you really think of these things as separate yet important and intersecting elements. What's going to be most important is to address very early on the space and the time that you have available. And so your collection is going to take up space, and many of the chapter related materials in the central area are still in homes or in personal storage items, chapter storage items, etc. So you want to make sure that you plan for your workspace realistically, and you want to set aside a temporary workspace if possible. So if it's a room or the section of a room, so that you can unpack and then repack the collection for each cycle of sorting that you go through. This is going to help a lot in terms of making some decisions around what you're going to do as it relates to data backup and what you're going to do as it relates to the physical archiving of materials. And so this slide outlines that an archive is a collection of data that's moved to a repository for backup, to keep separate for compliance reasons, or for moving primary storage media. Backups are copies of data. And so that's a huge delineation that we need to make. And they're stored for the purpose of recovery in case there are some challenges, or in case you want to transition the materials from one medium to another. So in other words, you may have two physical copies of a record, and you may want to make a digital record. And so the backup would be the digital record, because then you can move it from computer to iPad to iPhone to Android phone. It can go to various places. Backups are created using what is often described as replication or mirroring. And we update the files as they change, and they're stored as blocks to facilitate the recovery of a large amount of data at one time. And of course, items that are considered inactive and rarely altered data, which is not a copy, can be retained for a long period of time. And so why archive? And so it's really about retaining the older data that is so important to the history of the chapter, and or must be retained for future reference or regulatory compliance reasons. It's also critical that we archive to show the function of our organization or the function of an individual that is within our organization. And it's also to save space and primary storage. So we want to make sure that the backup systems restore and archive the systems that are retrievable. And then restoration, of course, is really about just developing a process through which we would restore and sustain a single file, a server, or a database. Let me talk a little more about the importance of the compliance for a regulatory perspective. So there have been times in history where nonprofit organizations have been asked to produce a historical arc of records, a historical corpus of materials to show their nonprofit impact within a community over an extended period of time. Sometimes those compliance situations change. Sometimes there are state regulatory processes that organizations need to go through. And periodically, there are federal regulatory processes that organizations need to go through. And this is why the archival records management piece is so important. And so in terms of storage options, our goal is to make sure that we have the capacity to store a large amount of data for a large period of time, and hopefully those costs will be manageable. There are several options. Some of these options, quite frankly, we have transitioned past, but nonetheless, we still have some materials within these different storage options. And so it's important to talk about it. So in the context of tape, of course, it's low cost, but it's tough because it's considered an obsolete medium. The same thing with disk. They're costly because it takes a lot to manage hard disk storage in the modern era. And so the other thing is that, when we're thinking about these different medium, we need to be assessing it within the framework of risk management. So we need to identify, assess, and prioritize risks to our collections. And this is why things like cassette tapes and floppy disks, we have to make sure that we are transitioning the important information off of those media onto a more current media. It's vital that we secure our necessary resources, including our insurance detail, to reduce and spread or transfer the risk and also minimize the impact of unfortunate events. We regrettably have lost a lot of history because of natural disasters and not really having materials stored in proper contained environments that are temperature regulated. So your risk management work will be all around those details to ensure collection perpetuity. This presentation is going to walk us through an important aspect of archival excellence, repository considerations. And so the repository, everyone, is the central site where our records are held and maintained, primarily for research and display purposes. Our National Archives for the Links Incorporated was established in 1993 at Howard University at the Moreland Springard Research Center. In terms of selecting a repository for your chapter, there are several aspects that you want to consider. One, you want to make sure that it's in a locale that is primarily accessible to a large majority of the chapter, and most specifically, the chapter president, the chapter archivist, and the Archives and History Committee, who will be tasked with taking materials back and forth to the repository from the chapter, from various chapter meetings, et cetera, and then also making sure that those individuals can execute the agreement with the repository. The other thing is that you want to ensure that the repository is adequately staffed. Are there enough individuals who are working there either in a full-time or in a part-time capacity that will be able to provide the chapter with assistance as you bring materials to the repository for interment? You also want to ensure that the repository has a really solid disaster relief plan. What does that look like if, heaven forbid, something happens with the repository due to a natural disaster? So you want to make sure that there is a clear understanding around their responsibility and duty as it relates to the protection of your collection within the context or within the framework of that disaster relief plan. And lastly, you want to make sure that they are a repository in which you could do a site visit and a tour and get all of your questions answered around engaging with the repository. The lion's share of repositories require what is referred to as a term of agreement. And this should be consistent and congruent with the chapter's mission and policy statement, and also in alignment with the Links Incorporated collection development policy. So access to the materials. So in other words, who has access to the respective collection? That needs to be incorporated in the agreement. Is it restricted to just members of the Links Incorporated? Is it restricted to links and researchers, to others? You want to make sure that you get those details down in writing. And then also which materials are accessible. And there definitely may be materials that you'll want to restrict access to over an extended period of time. And so in other words, sometimes the financial records of the chapter, depending on details that you'll receive from the area and the national financial leadership, you'll want to put some restrictions around who has access to that material. Also, the financial obligations should be incorporated in the terms of agreement. And so all related fees and expenses in relationship to the repository agreement, and also as you are depositing materials into the repository, should be incorporated. Also, everyone, ownership. And so when you transfer materials to a repository, they will often execute with you what is referred to as a deed of gift. It is a formal and a legal agreement. And so you really want to understand all of the conditions within that deed of gift so that you're not confused around the extent to which you and anyone else will have access to that material. And if you can remove materials from the repository at will. In the context of loans, that means that you're loaning certain items or certain assets of the chapter to the repository with an agreed upon time frame. And the chapter will maintain ownership of the collection and those assets. And so make sure that as you're having those conversations with the repository, that you're really clear on what the terms of agreement states. As it relates to transferring collections, you want to make sure that all the files are in order. So to the best of your ability, you want to structure them chronologically and/or alphabetically. You want to make sure that you have a folder list for every box that lists all of the materials inside of each box. You'll also want to create a transfer list that goes with each set of documents. You'll also want to notify the receiving archivist at the repository as to when the shipment or delivery is coming. And you'll want to periodically update that transfer list. And so please make sure that you review that with the chapter president and also with the incoming archivist and incoming area archivist. And so this is a part of the records management process that will definitely guide you towards archival excellence. And so as a recap, everyone, to all of the components that we have talked through as it relates to this important work that we are undergoing, we have now gone through 4 parts: archivists as legacy keepers, the chapter's archival program, the ABC of archiving, and repository considerations. Should you have any questions, feel free to contact our area interim chair, Link Arlene Moore Ross of the St. Louis chapter. Her telephone number and email are here for you. And of course, this presentation and all of the modules will be made available to you. Thank you so much, Sister Links, and let's continue to strive for archival excellence. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.